The priest kicked me out during my wife's funeral. Father Gregory's hand landed on my shoulder during the eulogy, his grip tight enough to leave marks through my suit jacket. "You need to leave," he whispered, but loud enough that the first 3 rows heard him. "This is a sacred space, and you're not welcome here." I stared at him, at my wife's casket 6 feet away draped in white roses, at the 200 people turning in their pews to watch my humiliation. My mother-in-law sat in the front row with a satisfied expression that made my stomach turn, while my wife's sister recorded the whole thing on her phone. The priest tightened his grip when I didn't move immediately, adding in a voice that carried to the back of the church, "Security has been notified. You can leave with dignity or be escorted out, but you will leave." That was 8 months ago. Last week, I watched that same priest resign in disgrace as federal investigators seized records from the archdiocese, and my former mother-in-law's lawyer called begging me to consider a settlement instead of pursuing criminal charges. I'd been married to Rebecca for 11 years when she died, and for 10 of those years her family had treated me like an unfortunate stain on their pristine Catholic lineage. Rebecca came from old money, the kind where her great-grandfather's name was on a hospital wing and her parents lived in a house with more bathrooms than my childhood home had rooms. I was a public school teacher making $53,000 a year when we met, and her father made it clear during our engagement that he'd tried to talk her out of marrying beneath her station. We had a small wedding because Rebecca wanted it that way, intimate and personal instead of the society event her mother had planned, and that first act of defiance set the tone for everything that followed. Her family tolerated me at holidays and family gatherings, but I was always the outsider, the man who'd somehow tricked their daughter into loving him instead of marrying the investment banker or surgeon they'd picked out. Rebecca was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer 3 weeks after her 35th birthday. The doctors gave her 18 months if the chemo worked, maybe 6 if it didn't. We spent those months trying to pack a lifetime into whatever time remained, taking trips we'd always planned, saying things we'd left unsaid, and making arrangements for after she was gone. She updated her will with our attorney, Frank Delgado, leaving everything to me, including her trust fund that her parents couldn't touch because her grandmother had set it up that way. Her family visited during her illness, but always with this undertone of accusation, like somehow my inferior genetics had caused her cancer. Her mother, Victoria, would inspect our house during visits, making notes about things that needed updating or repairs, commenting that Rebecca deserved better care than I could provide. I bit my tongue through all of it, because fighting with them would have stressed Rebecca, and she had enough to deal with. The last month was brutal, with Rebecca in and out of consciousness as the cancer spread to her liver and lungs. I took family leave from teaching, spending every moment at her bedside while hospice nurses came and went. Victoria and her husband Richard visited 3 times that month, each visit shorter than the last, as if they couldn't bear to watch their daughter dying in the home she shared with me. Rebecca's sister, Amanda, came once, spent 20 minutes scrolling through her phone in the corner, then left claiming she had a charity event she couldn't miss. When Rebecca died on a Saturday morning in September, I was holding her hand and telling her I loved her, while her family was at their country club for brunch. I called them after she passed, my voice breaking as I told Victoria her daughter was gone, and her first question was whether I'd contacted their family attorney yet. Not condolences, not grief, just legal logistics. The funeral arrangements happened without me, which should have been my first real warning that something was wrong. I'd been awake for 36 hours dealing with the hospice company, the medical examiner, and the funeral home, and when I finally sat down to start planning the service, Victoria called to tell me she'd already handled everything. Rebecca would be buried in the family plot at St. Catherine's, the church where she'd been baptized, with Father Gregory officiating because he'd known the family for 30 years. The service was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning, and I just needed to show up. I was too exhausted and grief-stricken to argue, telling myself that Victoria was trying to help, that planning her daughter's funeral was her way of processing loss. I told myself I was being paranoid when she asked me not to speak at the service because it would be too emotional for everyone, that having family members do the eulogies would be more appropriate. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. The first escalation came 3 days before the funeral, when Frank Delgado called me at 11 at night, his voice urgent in a way that cut through my grief fog. He'd received a letter from the Whitfield family attorney, a woman named Caroline Ung, who specialized in estate litigation, contesting Rebecca's will on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity. They were claiming that I'd manipulated Rebecca into changing her will while she was sick and unable to make sound decisions, despite the fact that she'd updated it 2 years before her diagnosis. Frank explained that will contests were common in families with money, but the timing was aggressive, filing before Rebecca was even buried. He needed me to gather documentation proving Rebecca's mental competency when she'd made the changes, medical records showing she was lucid and capable of making legal decisions, and anything that demonstrated our marriage was legitimate and not some scheme to access her money. I spent the next 2 days in a fog of paperwork and phone calls, pulling bank statements showing joint accounts we'd maintained for a decade, photos from trips and holidays proving we had a real relationship, text messages where Rebecca talked about updating her will to make sure I'd be taken care of if anything happened to her. Frank said it was solid evidence, but Caroline Ung was notorious for drawing out estate battles for years, bleeding the estate dry with legal fees until people settled just to make it stop. The Whitfields had unlimited resources to fight this, while I was a teacher with a mortgage and student loans. Frank was working on contingency because he genuinely liked Rebecca, but even he admitted that going up against Caroline Ung was going to be expensive and ugly. I was trying to process this information while planning what to wear to my wife's funeral, trying to figure out how to grieve when her family was already positioning me as the enemy. The night before the funeral, Amanda called me at midnight, her voice slurred with wine and something sharper. She said she was calling as a courtesy to warn me that people were asking questions about my relationship with Rebecca, about whether I'd been as devoted as I claimed, about whether there were reasons she might have wanted to leave me before she got too sick. The accusations were vague but poisonous, insinuations about affairs or abuse or financial manipulation, nothing concrete but enough to plant doubt. When I asked her directly what she was accusing me of, she backtracked, saying she was just letting me know what people were saying, that I should be prepared for uncomfortable questions at the funeral. The call left me shaking with rage and disbelief, unable to sleep while I replayed every moment of my marriage looking for whatever narrative they were trying to construct to justify stealing Rebecca's money. The funeral started normally enough, with me arriving at St. Catherine's 40 minutes early in the black suit Rebecca had bought me for her cousin's wedding 3 years ago. The church was already filling with her family's friends and business associates, people I'd met at occasional gatherings who'd always looked through me like I was part of the furniture. Victoria and Richard were in the front pew, dressed in expensive black, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of people used to performing grief publicly. Amanda sat with them, her phone out even in church, texting someone while people filed past Rebecca's casket. I tried to approach to pay my respects to my wife, but Victoria's brother, Uncle Philip, stepped into my path with a tight smile, suggesting I wait until after the service to avoid creating a scene. The audacity of being told to wait to see my own wife's body made my hands clench into fists, but I nodded and found a seat in the third row, watching strangers touch Rebecca's casket while I sat 20 feet away. Father Gregory began the service with a homily about Rebecca's devotion to family and faith, painting a picture of a woman I barely recognized. He talked about her charity work and her commitment to the church, conveniently omitting that she'd stopped attending regularly after we married because she couldn't stomach the hypocrisy. He mentioned her parents and sister multiple times, their strength and devotion during her illness, their unwavering support. My name never came up. I sat there listening to my wife's life being rewritten without me in it, erased from her story like our 11 years together had never happened. When Victoria stood to give a eulogy, she talked about Rebecca's childhood and her college years, her professional achievements, and her love for her family. She thanked everyone for their support during this difficult time, her voice catching with perfectly timed emotion. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that Rebecca had struggled in her final years with a difficult marriage that had caused her pain, and that they hoped she'd finally found peace. The words hit me like a physical blow, my breath catching in my throat as 200 people absorbed the implication that I'd made my dying wife's life miserable. I stood up without thinking, ready to defend myself, to call out the lie. That's when Father Gregory appeared beside me, his hand on my shoulder with that iron grip, telling me I needed to leave. The church went silent, except for the rustling of fabric as people turned to watch. Victoria's face showed no emotion, no surprise, like this had been planned all along. Father Gregory's voice carried as he repeated that I wasn't welcome, that this was a sacred space for celebrating Rebecca's life, and my presence was causing distress to her grieving family. I looked around for support, for anyone who knew me and Rebecca, but the few friends we'd had together weren't there. The guest list had been controlled by her family, inviting only people who'd never seen us together, who'd only heard whatever story they'd been told. Security appeared from the back of the church, 2 men in suits who weren't quite trying to look like they weren't security. Father Gregory nodded to them, and they moved up the aisle toward me while I stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. My wife's funeral was being weaponized against me, turned into a public spectacle designed to support whatever narrative they were building. I could fight it, make a scene, let them drag me out kicking and screaming, or I could leave with whatever dignity remained, letting them have this moment while I figured out what was really happening. I chose dignity, walking out of St. Catherine's while Amanda's phone captured every step, while Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while my wife's body lay in a casket I'd never gotten to approach. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, my hands shaking on the steering wheel while the rage and grief fought for dominance. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank saying we needed to talk immediately, and another from a number I didn't recognize. The unknown number had sent a video link, and when I clicked it, I found myself watching Amanda's live stream of my removal from the church, already posted to social media with a caption about my wife's family having to remove me for causing a disturbance during her funeral. The comments were loading in real time, people expressing sympathy for the Whitfield family, calling me everything from disrespectful to abusive. 300 people had already viewed it, the number climbing as I watched. They'd turned my grief into content, my humiliation into evidence for whatever case they were building. Frank met me at a coffee shop an hour later, his expression grim as he pulled out his laptop and showed me what Caroline Ung had filed that morning. A restraining order petition claiming I'd been abusive to Rebecca during her illness, citing unnamed witnesses who'd seen me yelling at her, withholding medication, and isolating her from family. A motion to freeze Rebecca's estate, pending investigation of financial exploitation, claiming I'd drained her accounts and forged documents, and a criminal complaint filed with the police alleging elder abuse and possible wrongful death, demanding an investigation into whether I'd hastened Rebecca's death through neglect or intentional harm. The documents were filed at 9 that morning, timed to hit while I was at the funeral, ensuring I'd be publicly humiliated before I even knew charges were coming. The allegations were absurd, easily disproven by medical records and witness statements from hospice nurses who'd been in our home daily. But Frank explained that truth didn't matter in the first 48 hours of a scandal, that public perception would form before I could defend myself, and Caroline Ung knew exactly what she was doing. She was betting that even when the charges were dismissed, the damage would be done to my reputation, making me radioactive to any jury that might hear the estate case. The live stream of me being removed from the funeral would be Prosecution Exhibit A, visual proof that even Rebecca's own church had deemed me unworthy of attending her funeral. Frank was already drafting responses, but he warned me that this was going to get much worse before it got better. The police showed up at my house that night at 9:30, two detectives who introduced themselves as Lisa Chen and David Moreno, 15 and 12 years on the force respectively. They asked if I'd come down to the station to answer some questions about Rebecca's death, nothing formal, just trying to understand the timeline. Frank had warned me this would happen, coaching me to be cooperative, but to insist on having him present for any formal questioning. I told them I'd be happy to answer questions with my attorney present, and their friendly demeanor shifted immediately. Detective Chen said that refusing to cooperate made me look guilty, that innocent people didn't lawyer up, that they just wanted to clear up some inconsistencies in the medical records. I repeated that I'd answer everything with my attorney present, and Detective Moreno handed me a card, telling me to have Frank call them to schedule something soon, before they had to get more official about it. Sleep was impossible that night, my mind racing through everything that had happened. I pulled up Amanda's social media and found multiple posts about the funeral, each one painting me as the villain in Rebecca's story. She'd written about how I'd isolated Rebecca from family, controlled her medical decisions, and refused to let them say goodbye properly. The comments were brutal, people I'd never met calling for my arrest, suggesting I'd killed Rebecca for her money, sharing the video of my removal from the funeral as proof of my guilt. I started documenting everything, taking screenshots and saving links, building my own case file of their defamation campaign. Around 3 a.m, I found a photo Amanda had posted from Rebecca's hospital room, one I'd never seen before, with a caption about how Rebecca had looked terrified when I entered the room. The photo was cropped to show only Rebecca's face, removing the context that she'd been in pain and waiting for medication, but it looked damning without explanation. Frank brought in a crisis management consultant the next day, a woman named Priya Kapoor, who specialized in reputation defense for people facing false accusations. She'd worked with executives wrongly accused of harassment, teachers caught in parent controversies, anyone whose life had been destroyed by social media mobs before truth could catch up. She reviewed everything the Whitfields had posted, building a timeline of their coordinated attack. The funeral removal had been planned, she said, with Amanda positioned to capture it, with Father Gregory briefed on when to act, with Caroline Ung filing legal documents timed to the event. The criminal complaint gave them cover to claim they were just concerned family members, while the social media campaign poisoned public opinion. Priya's strategy was to say nothing publicly while building an overwhelming evidence file, then release everything at once to destroy their narrative completely. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for Monday, 3 days after Rebecca's funeral. Caroline Ung presented her case with cold efficiency, calling Victoria to testify about witnessing me verbally abuse Rebecca, about seeing bruises on her arms that I'd allegedly caused, about Rebecca confiding that she was afraid of me. The lies were so detailed and specific that they almost sounded real, dates and times and quotes that Victoria delivered with practiced sorrow. She cried on the stand, describing how helpless she'd felt watching her daughter suffer at my hands, how Rebecca had begged her not to intervene because I'd threatened to cut off all family contact. The judge, Honorable Patricia Nolan, 20 years on the bench, listened with increasing concern, taking notes while Victoria painted me as a monster. When it was my turn to present evidence, Frank methodically destroyed every claim. He had text messages from Rebecca to her best friend, a woman named Sophie Laurent, who'd moved overseas before Rebecca got sick, talking about how controlling her mother was and how grateful she was that I'd protected her from family drama. He had emails from hospice nurses documenting their daily visits, noting that I was present and attentive, that Rebecca was comfortable and well cared for, that there were no signs of abuse or neglect. He had the medical examiner's report showing that Rebecca had died from cancer complications consistent with end-stage ovarian cancer, with no evidence of hastened death or mistreatment, and he had video from our home security system showing Victoria's last visit to our house, where Rebecca had asked her to leave after Victoria had suggested that Rebecca change her will to protect the family from me. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Judge Nolan's expression shifted as the evidence mounted, from concern to skepticism to barely contained anger. When she denied the restraining order, she added that the petition appeared to be filed in bad faith, using the court system to harass a grieving widower, and that she was referring the matter to the Bar Association for review of Caroline Ng's conduct. Caroline's face remained impassive, but Victoria's showed genuine shock, like she'd expected her family name and money to be enough to win regardless of facts. Frank requested sanctions for the frivolous filing, and Judge Nolan ordered the Whitfields to pay my legal fees for the hearing, a small victory, but a public one. Outside the courtroom, Amanda was waiting with her phone, but Priya had positioned our own videographer to document their harassment, creating a counter-narrative we could use later. The criminal investigation fell apart even faster once detectives Chen and Moreno actually reviewed the evidence. The hospice company provided detailed logs of every visit, every medication administered, every interaction they'd witnessed between Rebecca and me. Her oncologist, Dr. Raymond Wells, submitted a statement saying that Rebecca's death had been expected and that I'd followed all care instructions perfectly, advocating for her pain management and ensuring she remained comfortable. The medical examiner confirmed that Rebecca's body showed no signs of trauma or neglect, that her death certificate accurately reflected cancer as the cause. Within a week, the investigation was closed with no charges filed, and Frank immediately sent demand letters to the Whitfields threatening defamation litigation unless they retracted their public statements. Father Gregory became the unexpected weak link in their plan. Priya had hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent named Thomas Reeves, 23 years in white-collar crime before retiring to private work. He started digging into St. Catherine's finances and found that the Whitfield family was the largest donor to the church, contributing over $200,000 annually for the past 15 years. Father Gregory's personal finances showed irregularities too, including a car registered in his name but purchased through a church account, a condo in Florida that he couldn't afford on a priest's salary, and quarterly payments from a Whitfield family trust for consulting services. The pattern suggested that Father Gregory's loyalty was purchased, that his willingness to remove me from the funeral was just another service rendered to his most important donors. Thomas kept digging and found something even more damaging. Father Gregory had a history of similar behavior, using his position to help wealthy parishioners with personal problems that had nothing to do with spiritual guidance. He'd testified in a divorce case 5 years earlier, providing character evidence against a husband who'd discovered his wife's affair, swearing under oath that the husband had been abusive despite no evidence. The wife's family were major donors. He'd intervened in a custody dispute, writing a letter to the court questioning a father's fitness, helping the mother gain full custody. The mother's parents funded a new parish building. The pattern was clear. Father Gregory provided moral cover for wealthy families in exchange for donations, weaponizing his religious authority to help them get what they wanted. Priya worked her media contacts to place the story with the investigative journalist named Rachel Kimura, who'd built her career exposing corruption in religious institutions. Rachel spent 3 weeks verifying everything, interviewing former parishioners who'd witnessed Father Gregory's favoritism toward wealthy donors, reviewing financial records that showed the scope of church funds being used for his personal benefit, documenting the pattern of him intervening in legal matters on behalf of donors. Her article dropped on a Sunday morning, timed to maximum impact, detailing how Father Gregory had turned St. Catherine's into a pay-to-play operation, where wealthy families could buy religious validation for their worst behavior. The response was immediate and devastating. The Archdiocese issued a statement announcing that Father Gregory had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, that they took allegations of financial impropriety seriously, and that they were conducting a full audit of St. Catherine's accounts. Victoria and Richard released their own statement, claiming they'd had no knowledge of any inappropriate relationship with Father Gregory, that they'd donated to the church in good faith, and that they were shocked to learn their generosity had been exploited. The statements were carefully crafted by Caroline Ng to distance them from the scandal, but Rachel had already published the receipts showing that Victoria had personally requested Father Gregory's intervention in my case, texting him about handling the situation at the funeral days before Rebecca died. The Bar Association opened an investigation into Caroline Ng's conduct based on Judge Nolan's referral, reviewing the restraining order petition and the fraudulent allegations used to support it. Legal ethics complaints piled up as other people who'd faced her tactics came forward, telling stories of manufactured evidence and witness coaching, of prolonged litigation designed to bankrupt opponents rather than seek justice. She'd built a reputation as the attorney you hired when truth didn't matter and you just needed to win, and that reputation was now destroying her. Within a month, she was facing a suspension hearing, with multiple clients firing her as the scandal grew. The estate case collapsed once the criminal investigation closed and the restraining order was denied. Frank filed a motion to dismiss the will contest as frivolous, presenting all the evidence of Rebecca's mental competency and her clear intentions. Caroline Ng tried to argue that they should be allowed to pursue discovery, to depose witnesses and examine records, but Judge Nolan shut her down, noting that the initial petition had been based on fabricated allegations of abuse, and that allowing it to proceed would reward bad faith litigation. She dismissed the contest with prejudice, meaning the Whitfields couldn't refile, and awarded Frank's fees to be paid from their personal accounts rather than Rebecca's estate. The amount was substantial, over $150,000, enough to hurt even people with their wealth. Sophie Laurent, Rebecca's best friend, returned from London specifically to give a deposition in the defamation case Frank filed against the Whitfields. She brought with her years of text messages and emails from Rebecca, documenting every family conflict, every attempt by Victoria to control Rebecca's life, every time Rebecca had leaned on me for support against her family's pressure. Sophie's testimony painted a devastating picture of a woman trapped between loyalty to her family and love for her husband, who'd chosen me again and again, despite knowing it would cost her their approval. She read texts where Rebecca called her mother manipulative and controlling, where she'd joked that marrying me was the best act of rebellion she'd ever committed, where she'd explicitly stated that her family would try to steal her money after she died and that I needed to fight them. The mediation for the defamation case happened 6 months after Rebecca's funeral, in a conference room where Victoria and Richard sat across from me with their new attorney, a man named Kenneth Frost, who specialized in settling cases before they went to trial. Frank had prepared a demand package showing exactly what we'd prove in court: the coordinated conspiracy to fabricate abuse allegations, the financial relationship with Father Gregory, the social media campaign designed to destroy my reputation, the use of Rebecca's funeral as a weapon. The damages would be substantial, not just for actual harm, but for punitive damages meant to punish their conduct. Kenneth reviewed everything, went pale, and asked for a caucus with his clients. 2 hours later, they came back with a settlement offer, a full public retraction of all allegations, posted to the same social media platforms where they'd defamed me. A written apology, acknowledging that their claims were false and that I'd been a devoted husband to Rebecca, payment of all my legal fees plus $500,000 in damages, and the agreement to never contact me again or speak publicly about Rebecca's death or our marriage. Frank looked at me, waiting for my decision. The money meant nothing compared to what I'd lost, but the public vindication, the formal acknowledgement that they'd lied, that mattered. I accepted the settlement. The public apology posted to Victoria's social media the next day was everything I'd wanted. It stated clearly that all allegations of abuse were false, that they'd been motivated by grief and a misguided desire to control Rebecca's estate, and that I'd been nothing but loving and supportive during her illness. It acknowledged that they'd orchestrated my removal from the funeral, and that it had been wrong. It admitted that their criminal complaint had been baseless. The comments section filled with people who'd previously condemned me now apologizing, now expressing outrage at the Whitfields for their behavior. Amanda's posts were deleted, her account eventually going private under the weight of backlash. Father Gregory was formally defrocked 8 months after the scandal broke. The Archdiocese investigation found extensive financial misconduct, including embezzlement of church funds, acceptance of improper payments from parishioners, and abuse of his religious authority for personal gain. The Florida condo was seized, the car repossessed, and he was referred to federal prosecutors for potential criminal charges related to the financial crimes. St. Catherine's got a new priest, a younger man named Father Miguel Santos, who'd been assigned specifically to rebuild trust and clean up the parish's reputation. He reached out to me through Frank, offering to hold a memorial service for Rebecca if I wanted one, a proper goodbye without her family's interference. I declined, but appreciated the gesture. The federal investigation into the Archdiocese's handling of donor funds expanded beyond Father Gregory, uncovering a systemic problem of wealthy families using donations to buy influence and favors from church leadership. The scandal made national news, with Rachel Kimura's original article being cited as the catalyst for the investigation. The Archdiocese implemented new financial controls and transparency measures, and several other priests were quietly reassigned or retired as their own questionable relationships with donors came to light. In a weird way, Rebecca's funeral became the starting point for cleaning up corruption that had existed for decades. I sold the house Rebecca and I had shared, unable to live with the memories of both her death and the nightmare that followed. The settlement money and Rebecca's estate gave me financial security I'd never had as a teacher, and I took a year off to process everything that had happened. Therapy helped, working with a grief counselor named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who specialized in traumatic loss complicated by family conflict. She helped me separate my grief for Rebecca from my anger at her family, to mourn my wife without letting their betrayal poison those memories. I started writing about the experience, processing it through words, and eventually those writings became a book about navigating loss when the systems meant to support you become weapons against you. The book found an unexpected audience, resonating with people who'd experienced similar betrayals by family or institutions during vulnerable times. I heard from other people who'd been shut out of funerals by hostile relatives, from those who'd faced false allegations during estate battles, from anyone who'd learned that grief doesn't pause for legal warfare. My inbox filled with stories worse than mine, reminding me that what I'd survived, while brutal, was not unique. The visibility made me a resource for others facing similar situations, and I started consulting with attorneys on cases involving funeral interference and estate manipulation, using my experience to help others fight back. 2 years after Rebecca's funeral, I scattered her ashes at a beach we'd visited on our honeymoon. Just me and Sophie and a sunset that painted the sky in colors Rebecca had loved. There was no priest, no ceremony, no family drama, just a quiet moment to finally say goodbye to my wife, without anyone turning it into a weapon or a performance. I poured her ashes into the ocean and watched them disappear into the waves, feeling something release in my chest that had been locked tight since that day at St. Catherine's. Rebecca would have hated what her family did, would have been furious at their lies and manipulation, and would have laughed at how spectacularly their plan had backfired. Victoria and Richard moved to their vacation home in the Carolinas permanently, unable to face the social consequences of the scandal in their hometown. Their friends had turned on them once the truth came out, with some confiding to mutual acquaintances that they'd always found the Whitfields' treatment of me cruel, but hadn't wanted to risk social exclusion by defending me. Amanda deleted all her social media accounts, and last I heard was living abroad, trying to escape her role in the debacle. The Whitfield name, once synonymous with charity and social prominence, had become associated with corruption and cruelty, their legacy permanently tarnished by their attempt to steal Rebecca's money and destroy my life. I think about Rebecca every day, about the life we built together and the future we lost to cancer. But I don't think about her funeral anymore. Don't let that day define my grief or my memories of her. She knew her family would try something after she died, had warned me they couldn't help themselves, had made me promise I'd fight them if they tried to rewrite our story. I kept that promise, and in doing so, exposed rot that went far beyond one family's greed. Father Gregory lost his collar, Caroline Ung lost her license to practice law, and the Whitfields lost the reputation they valued more than their own daughter's happiness. The priest who kicked me out of my wife's funeral did it for money. Simple as that. He traded his integrity and his vows for Florida real estate and a luxury car, and when that transaction became public, everything he'd built came down. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks about that morning at St. Catherine's, if he regrets choosing the Whitfields' donations over basic human decency. Probably not. People like him don't think they'll ever face consequences, don't believe the rules apply to them, don't imagine that their victims might fight back hard enough to win. He was wrong about that. They all were. Rebecca's trust fund sits in an account bearing her name, funding scholarships for teachers and cancer research in her memory. Her family gets no credit for the good that money does, no plaques with their names, no photo opportunities at charity events. It's all in Rebecca's name, honoring the woman she was rather than the image they tried to create. And every student who gets a scholarship, every researcher who gets a grant, is a reminder that they lost. That love defeated greed. That truth survived their lies. Rebecca would have liked that ending. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.